This is my rapidly growing colony of fire ants who are in desperate need of a new foraging area, which is exactly what I will be making them in this action-packed episode on the Ants USA YouTube channel. But before we get into all of that, I would like to ask you guys to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Now, without further ado, let's get into the video. This is my fire ant colony's current setup. Today, we will be focusing on the outworld, where the ants are devouring a cut-up superworm. As you can see, these ants are ravenously consuming the superworm, which is so typical of this species. However, the colony wasn't always like this, and in its beginning days was a much smaller and less noticeable force, as you can tell by this footage from 3 months ago. Now, the reason they need a new outworld as soon as possible is to limit the escapes, which are becoming a bit of an issue, as well as the fact that the colony is simply outgrowing the outworld. This foraging area was always meant to serve as an intermediary stage between the small test tube hub and a larger outworld, and it has served its purpose. Another problem that I have been facing with this small outworld is how hard it is to clean out all of the moldy leftovers, which the sheer number of ants running around was making very difficult to do. Before we build these ants a new foraging area, let's take a look at their progress in their new nest that we gave them in the last video. As you can see, the ants have built a large mound on the side of the tube, which is a result of their rigorous digging activities. So this is how this setup works. The ants travel from the nest down this tube, which leads to the test tube hub, from where the ants can either drink from the water and sugar test tubes or make their way into the outworld for food. To combat the mold and the leftovers, his new outworld will need a cleanup crew, which will consist of these guys. These are soil creatures who I have taken from the mulch in my box turtles enclosure. These beetles, earwigs, springtails, and isopods will now be needing a new home, so let's start building the outworld. The first step in building this new space is to add the plants. Basil to be exact. Now, adding in the soil creatures. I am putting them in the bottom layer of soil so the ants can't get to them easily. Now on to the next step, adding this layer of gravel, which will serve as a drainage layer. If you don't already know, a drainage layer provides a place for any excess water to go, so it doesn't flood the rest of the substrate. As you can see by all the movements around this basil plant, there is already a small community of life established in here. Next, we will be covering the drainage layer with some sand. I chose to use sand due to the fact that it won't hold moisture as well as other types of soil, so the ants won't try to move into the outworld. Next, I will cover the fine wet sand with a more coarse variety to add texture, adding some pebbles. After a few hours of work, this was the result. It is now time to connect the new outworld to the rest of the colony setup. I will need to connect this port to here, and this port to here, as well as disconnect the old outworld. So, here it goes. Removing the colony's birth test tube. The tube was firmly stuck inside the port, so it took a bit of prying to get it out. Now to connect the tube leading to the new outworld. All done. Pretty much immediately, the ants began to explore this new addition to their setup. They were a bit confused, as they were used to their founding test tube being connected to this port. Now to connect the second tube in place of the water test tube. Finished. I could now make the final connection from the new outworld to the colony setup, which would secure the new space as the fire ants' new hunting grounds. Now, the last step in completing this new addition to the colony's setup is to disconnect the old outworld. After disconnecting it, I had to plug the exit with cotton so that the ants wouldn't escape during this process. All done. I will show you what I did with these guys later on. I decided to attach a water test tube for hydration in place of the old outworld. Unfortunately, I was not able to film the ants actually entering the outworld for the first time, but they seemed pretty excited. This initial worker explored these lands with much enthusiasm, which was understandable as this is by far the largest space the colony has ever interacted with. I decided to entice more ants to come out with a food offering in the form of a superworm. In no time, the superworm was discovered by one of the workers, who decided that it needed backup, so it ran off to inform the rest of the colony. After a few minutes, there was a small trail of workers going to and from the superworm. Looks like that's what we needed to get the ants to come out. After about an hour, the colony was emerging from the nest in much greater numbers, as the pheromone trail to the superworm was well established. The ants still seemed a bit cautious, however. This was probably because they were still not used to the size of this new outworld. Unfortunately, the ants quickly lost interest in the offering, which I left to be consumed by the soil creatures. However, the colony's attitude changed after I decided to offer them a more protein-rich morsel, a fly. In no time, the fly was absolutely swarmed by the ants, who quickly began to devour it. As I watched the ants consume the fly, I noticed that there were maggots escaping the fly's abdomen. This must be some sort of last-ditch attempt to survive by the fly, because if the fly itself is dying, giving birth to its maggots would give them a slim chance of surviving and passing on the fly's genes. Unfortunately for the fly, however, the maggots would almost certainly be consumed by the ants. After a quick inspection, the workers began to take notice of the squirming maggots, who they began collecting to bring back to the nest in order to feed the rest of the colony. The ants were still a bit hesitant to harvest the fly larvae, which made it seem like they were still employing some sort of biological mechanism to pacify the ants. When I checked back up on the ants a few hours later, I found that they had collected all of the maggots, and although I couldn't tell for sure, I suspected that this was the last maggot. The ants seemed very invigorated by this food offering. So much so, in fact, that they even came back and revisited the abandoned superworm carcass and began to eat it. The colony's trail can be seen here traveling through the tubes. The ants have now discovered both tubes and are using them to get to the food located in the new outworld. Later that night, I gave the ants a moth I found, which they greatly enjoyed. It seems like they prefer to eat flying insects. As we are now nearing the end of the video, I would like to thank all those watching and remind you guys to like and subscribe, especially if you want to see more videos like this one.